What's up, Soul Nation, and welcome to another No Rest for the Wicked video. This is an exclusive interview with me and Thomas, and we get into it. There is so much to unpack. In fact, if you're looking at the runtime of this video, it is a monster. So I would like to encourage you guys to feel free to use the chapter markers in this video if you want to jump to any specific section, but I would really appreciate any engagement that you guys want to toss this video so that YouTube knows that it's worth your time as well as worth others' time, and that would be a real big help for the channel itself. So any kind of engagement, a like, a comment, a subscribe, all of the above, a share, and if you guys, the best metric of all is watch time. So hopefully you guys get to sit back, grab yourself a drink, use this as a podcast. There is so much that we go into, but there are a few things I want to set expectations. I don't want you watching this video thinking that they're going to announce the console release date. Trust me, I'm as excited as you are, and as soon as they're ready to share that information, you will have it. We touch on it a little bit, but if you're looking for like that specific detail, unfortunately, I can't share that with you. There's also a few things that we've cut out of the interview because there are things they want to share with us, and they are working on getting that ready. And based off of those things, I want to be respectful for the studio and the people behind both the marketing campaigns and the hard work in development. That's going to be the case. The last note that I want to kind of give you guys before we get into the full interview is I want to try and bring an understanding of what's going on behind the scenes. And that's usually a function of time. Whenever I see gamers and developers kind of collide, it's usually under different expectations of what something takes to actually make happen in a video game. And that's how you'll see I kind of tailor my questions. We talk about various different time. Also, I propose lots of fun ideas. You can let me know in the comments if you like them, if you hate them. I'm very open to feedback. And I also, later in this interview, took the questions that you guys have given me. Some of them kind of got seeded in throughout the interview, but there is just a specific section because you guys are so great, and I thank you so much for being a part of this community. Now, I've rambled on long enough. Sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Before, I would not want to open the windows. I just, I actually had an interesting thing. I bought a new workstation a while ago, and I had this problem now with the Intel 14th generation.
Okay, so
stuff. I don't know if you heard that.
I've been hearing that. I have massive
nerves
because I literally just ordered a PC that's a 14th generation i9. And
oh my God, yeah. Buckle up, because, dude, I tried to open up our repository, right, and had like, oh, it's running out of RAM, or
wow,
it has compilation errors and so on. And it's all like, I couldn't figure out what was going on, right? Just couldn't figure it out. And then all this stuff with Intel dropped and so on, and totally I'm screwed by that, right? So now I did a BIOS update and it works now, knock on wood, but at a lower performance.
I heard from my chat because they knew, like, my PC, for whatever reason, decided to recently just itself. So if I turn it off, there's no guarantee I can get it back on. So sometimes I've spent 4 hours trying to get it to turn back on. So as long as I keep it on. So we've ordered a new PC, and it's an i9, and all of a sudden everybody's like, oh my gosh, Intel screwed up. There's going to be a BIOS fix. So it hasn't officially shipped yet. So I'm in that boat. And from a development perspective, that's going to be the, like, I have everything. And
it's just the weirdest thing I've ever experienced in my 20-30 years now of working with Windows, right? That it's just, I've never seen a CPU issue where it's like, it shows all these random errors of like, hey, your hard drive can't do this, or your RAM, you run out of RAM, or all this kind of stuff. And it's the CPU. Like, how in the world,
it really does show you how much Intel sat on their heels, because AMD has really done some work. And I've been listening to various different, geo manufacturers, like, how this is being manufactured in Taiwan and over here, and just how, like, Intel wasn't, they were more interested in being a mature company paying out dividends for the stock, as opposed to like actively like trying to make sure that they maintain that market dominance. And I think they're paying for it right now, which is freaking wild.
I think that's generally interesting, right? Like even in the games industry right now, this whole thing of like, when do you become too corporate, and like at what point, like you can't ever rest on your laurels, right? Like I think to some degree, like that's also what happened with Blizzard and so on, right? Where it's just, you if you're not that hungry anymore and that passionate anymore, at some point, there's going to be other players who just will eat your lunch.
Well, you mentioned many times, I think your team size is 90 people at Moon. Is that
90
correct?
people right now, yeah.
So
Yeah.
even still, that takes an extra level of management. Just throwing
Yeah.
people at a problem doesn't mean that there's going to be anything solved. We saw that literally with Anthem and how it just the bed where everybody was just not knowing what they were doing. Leadership plays a critical role. Having a vision, but then also having, I don't know, the balls to put it on the line and say, this is what we want to make. And I see that happen a lot. We saw that with Elden Ring. I always kind of laugh when a Souls-like comes out because it's the same conversation every time. The game needs to be more accessible versus, well, can't they just make a game? It doesn't need to be for everybody. And I think you guys with this game have really hit that line really well. I love the perspective. In fact, this game just took me by storm. So I really do appreciate you wanting to hang out and talk with me, because I was like, yeah, like here we go, like this is like I like this game is so fun.
Well, our goal was really simple, right? Like we just really wanted to do this thing where it's like, well, we saw ARPGs in the early 2000s, right? Like I played the crap out of Diablo 2, right? And my
Yeah.
thinking was always, man, I can't wait for what they will do with Diablo 3 and then Diablo 4. Imagine the kind of games we would play 10 years from now, right?
Yeah.
15 years from now. Then I don't know how you experienced Diablo 3, right? But I played it and I was like, it's not bad, right? But it's not that giant leap, that huge revolution of like, oh my god, like really, like that's where they took it, right? That kind of feeling of like, wow, like when I played Diablo for the first time, Diablo 1, right?
Yeah.
That to me felt like, holy shit, like they really dared, right? And they really did something here. And then when Diablo 2 came out, it was the same thing where it's like,
Yeah.
this is systemic, and like, you play through and you kill Diablo for the first time, and then it's like, oh my god, like there's really a reason why I play these higher difficulty modes and so on. And people played it for 10 years, right?
Yeah.
Like, or even longer. And now, even now, right, like Diablo 2 Resurrected, there's a huge player base just playing that game, and it's still the same game, right? And so that's where we were at, right? And then when we finished Ori, I was like, I bet we could do something really interesting now, right? Like we did Ori,
Mm-hmm.
where we basically just showed the world, hey, here's what we can do, right? And Ori was always a little bit of a niche thing, right? Because
Yeah.
it's a platformer, and there's lots of people out there who like. I'm 40 years old now, right? So I still grew up with playing on the NES, right?
Yeah.
And even the Atari 2700 and so on, right? Um, but these days, like, and in 8 and 16-bit days, right, like playing platformers was your bread and butter, right?
Yeah.
Like that was just, every game almost was a platformer, right? So to me, it was like, for Ori, the whole thing was like, man, why isn't anybody making a platforming game that is as good as Super Mario Bros. 3 or something,
yeah.
right? I'm sure there would be tons of people that would enjoy that, right? And then the whole thing was, and Metroidvania, same thing, right? Like, why isn't anybody making Metroidvanias anymore after Super Metroid, right? And you had this whole Konami thing of like, why aren't they allowing Koji Igarashi to actually make a AAA Castlevania, right, on a AAA platform? And then we did that, right? And it actually really worked. And then the whole thing was, okay, now that we did this, Ori kind of like was our Mario, that kind of thing. That, man, if we would do Zelda, that would be crazy. And by the way, we are a smaller studio. We don't have the same risk profile as if Blizzard would work for 4 or 5 years on something, right? I wanted to really just see this as like this huge passion project where it's just, like, let's fulfill that dream finally, right? That dream of like what I've been envisioning since the early 2000s, right? Where I was hoping the next Diablo would go. But let's do that. Let's finally do that, right? So other studios didn't go there, and I don't quite understand why. And I wanted to do all this daring stuff, right? Like all the, like, let's have housing in there. Let's have, fishing, and just generally like really making the world feel alive and interactive, right? So that every inch there's something for you to do, right? But that also goes to
That's the first thing I take away from when I stepped into it, because like in the trailer, you're like, handcrafted. We're not procedurally generating like these worlds. And I'm like, oh, that's gonna be okay. Well, how's that gonna affect every time I run through it? And then what I found, and you guys still haven't turned on like the next layer of the plague
The
system,
plague system, yeah.
which is gonna really make the world feel a little bit more alive. So I'm excited for whatever that ends up being, just to see it in play out in the game. But the thing I'm finding is that I love that the world is traversable, and then you also modify it from time to time. Sometimes there's something blocking this door. Sometimes I got to go do this thing, but it still makes the world like I discover something and I know that it's there, and I can go back to it and check to see if there maybe that chest is going to spawn right now or not, or just as a part of my. And so I appreciate that.
That was my whole thing, right? Like, so we went from making Ori, which was extremely focused on on level design, basically, right? Because if you have a platformer, like 70% of that is, are your levels fun to play, right? And the other 140% is your character actually fun to play with, right? But like, there's such a huge importance on level design, right? And we did that for 10 years, and we felt like, I don't like these, or I felt that way. I don't like these procedurally generated levels that we see all the time, right? Or these open world games where, like a lot of studios right now, like, and I don't want to be again like talking other studios down or something, right? Because like there's
Dev is
super
hard.
crazy talented people everywhere. Dev is super hard. But just generally, like from a design perspective, right? Like there's only like a lot of like, I think there's this expectation almost, right? And even with Elden Ring, that's interesting, right? That you have to kind of like do open world because everybody wants a huge open world, right? And devs even had this whole thing of like, well, we have a 32,000 square kilometers big game, right? Big world to explore, right? But ultimately, it should be, yeah. But how much fun per inch are we talking, right?
Yeah.
Like, because I can easily, like you're a developer yourself, right? I can easily make a huge terrain in Unity and just apply a height map to it and have fun running through empty areas, right? And
Where
so on.
there's
And it's
nothing
just
to see or do.
nothing, no stuff to interact with, right? And so on. And to me, it's always, no, it should be built inch by inch by a designer who has this whole idea of like, hey, so if I'm here, there's this and this and this to do, and then I walk forward, and there's this. And we think of it in like screens, right?
Yeah.
Because also top down, and before we did platformers, like, is there something cool for you to do on every screen? And by the way, I mean, I even went back to, like, I'm a huge fan of obviously Nintendo as well, right? And like, when you play Zelda
I'm
1,
such a diehard Nintendo fanboy that it's embarrassing.
yeah, me too.
It's just like, oh, guys, like people were like, you're an Xbot or you're a Sony pony. I go, oh, you don't know who I am. Like I get
Right.
mad though at Nintendo because I'm like, I wish their online infrastructure was just a little bit better.
Yeah.
And I do have a question about your multiplayer mode because you have teased the, what you're talking about with your net code, and I'm just very curious.
We can get into all of that, but let me say the
Yeah.
thing. So, for example, when I looked at Zelda 1, right?
Yeah.
Literally with Zelda 1, right? Like, on if you just look at it screen by screen, right? There's a secret basically almost behind every single screen, right? And there's always like, and here's these enemies and so on. So they had to squeeze out of every single screen, right? Like, just make sure that every screen has something going for it, right? And I feel like today with a lot of these open world games, because, and I'm pretty sure the same was true for Nintendo, by the way, with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, right? Where you start with a sculpted terrain, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to hire an army of people to fill that stuff up with content, right? With like, is this little area fun enough? Is this fun enough, etc. And ultimately, you will fail somewhere, right? Like, you will then, oh my God, we're shipping in a year, right? So we're accepting that this stretch actually doesn't really have any gameplay, and you're just running through by holding the analog stick up for 2 minutes,
Yeah,
and do nothing. And so I found it a little bit disparaging in that sense. For example, right, like the Souls games, if you look at their sales data and so on, they've always been huge critical darlings, but they always used to sell like 3 to 5 million copies, right?
right.
Then Elden Ring was the first Souls game that had an open world, and suddenly it sells 25 million copies or something. It's weird. It's obviously, I don't know if it was the open world, right? But personally, I'm kind of like, I'm the designer where it's like, if it's not fun, cut it, right? If something doesn't work, if something just doesn't come together, if there's if it's empty space, cut it, right? And just leave the really good stuff in there, right? Almost like if you're making a menu in a restaurant, right? Like you want to make sure that this dish doesn't really work, throw it out, right? Like you don't want a menu that has like 500 options in it. You want a menu that's like 15 things,
Yeah.
but everything is amazing.
How difficult is that call to be made, knowing how much time you've put into that dish, right? When you run into that with this game or with Ori, how difficult is that decision to cut it when it doesn't meet mustard, knowing that you maybe put 3 months, 6 months, a year?
It's not difficult at all.
Okay.
It's not difficult at all. We're not, like we are, like we even said this with Ori, right? Like if it look, we give everybody time to kind of like turn something into like a fun place or something, right? Like to make something fun. But if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, right? If the deal isn't right, the deal isn't right, right? And so then you have to be brutal about cutting it, right? Because ultimately, what you want is just this extremely compressed package full of fun, right? And if something isn't fun, you don't do the players any service by keeping it in, right? And you don't do yourself any a disservice, because now you have to set dress it. Now you have to make sure it kind of you somehow works, even though back in your mind you know this isn't really fun to play, right? So I think if you want to make a really good game, you also have to be brutal with cuts, and you have to be okay with, we spent 4 months of development time on this, but it doesn't work, so cut it and leave the good stuff.
The one of the things I'd like to see, and if you know, without having you commit to timelines and these answers, is the thing I see a lot on online discourse around games is that there's a lot of gamers who don't and have never worked in development or made games for themselves, and so there's always this friction between what something should be or shouldn't be. Now, I think of development as, I don't think of it in terms of hard and easy. I think of it just in terms of how much time do we think it's going to take to need that. You mentioned,
because everything is hard.
Yeah, everything's hard. Like how much time? It's all a function of time. So with that in mind, without like again committing to anything to anybody on this case, when you're talking about crafting these zones, when you're talking about setting up this world, whether it's by zone, how much time from design to actually like, you know, development and then implementation, putting the package together, does that take? Is that a 3? I always kind of say like think 3, 6, 9, and 12 months in terms of development, and that's where you're going to start to kind of see how things come together. Does it fall like what time frame would that fall into for
it's
y'all?
really hard to say, because we had such a weird development period with Wicked, right? Where Wicked was created basically, I did the first prototypes in December of 2015.
Oh wow. Okay.
Which is pretty crazy, right? So
Yeah.
that was just me like knowing, hey, we had just shipped Ori and the Blind Forest, and we almost shipped the definitive edition a year later, right? Like we were wrapping that up, and my back then girlfriend, now my wife, went to Argentina, right? And was like, you know, was on vacation there, and that was around Christmas period, and I was just, oh my god, I'm done with my design work on Blind Forest on the definitive edition. I just want to sit down and do a prototype, right? And then I always had Wicked in the back of my, like as an ace up my hole. And as a studio, we just decided, you know, like, hey, Microsoft wants us to make an Ori sequel. The producers, Mark Coates, and so on, like really convinced us, guys, you could take all the stuff that you already have, you could perfect it, right? Which as a developer is really interesting thing, right? Because that was our first title. There was a ton of stuff that we cut. And it just felt like, man, we started something here, it's good, but there's a lot of stuff that we cut. It would be great to kind of like have another go at it, to just try to do the absolute best that we could, and hopefully ship one of the best, if not the best, Metroidvania ever made, right? Because we felt like we caught some magic in a bottle. We thought we could do it again and just improve everything, right? Every single thing. And then at the same time, I was already working on that prototype. I was the one who had to be convinced to do a sequel.
Yeah.
But it made sense for the studio. So, but I kept working in the background, kind of like on Wicked for a long time, just with like 1, 2, 3, 4 people, right? Just so we get something done. And like, even the prototype was already really fun, and we felt like, hey, this is going somewhere. But it was always kind of like a project kind of like in the background until like 2018, I think, is when we finally signed it and like put it into production. But then we still had all the crazy period with like Will of the Wisps, which shipped March of 2020. So in reality, the actual game took us about 4 years to make. But you see kind of like how the development has been so crazy, right? That there's a lot of designs that went through years of just fiddling with it and changing it. And actually, I mean, I don't want to right now because it's live, right? But maybe we could do it non-live. I could show you the world that we already built, right? Like the Isola Sakura that we actually have live. And the Isola Sakura where tons of stuff is already built.
Yeah.
And how big it is and so on, right? It's just not ready. It's not polished yet.
Right.
It's not ready yet. But there's so much stuff that we already built. It's hard to say because we didn't start an area from scratch recently where we then just went, here's the concept, here's the thing, we had quite some time to build this up. So it's hard to say, but I would guess for one of our zones, average size, probably a good 3 to 6 months or so.
Yeah, see, that's right. Usually in the ballpark that I tend to put things, because when I see your answers, I'm always trying to decipher them. Like, all right, when my dev brain, how this translates, because I just entered into pre-production on a video game that I'm making with the development studio, and I'm going to tell you hands down, don't sue me, but your gearing system is by far a great inspiration, and I'm using some of that in terms of like, I love it. You have commons, which are the most flexible. You have rare, which has some benefits, not as flexible. Cursed, there's a disadvantage there, and then you have obviously uniques, and I'm like, this is genius. I always was like, you would just get this gear at some point that was just pointless, and it was just filling your inventory. Not in this case. It's all what you as a player want to do.
Well, there's two answers that I have to this, right? So first of all, I see games as an art form, right? And similar to back then in the Renaissance, right? Like, of course, the artists studied each other's work, right? And like, how did that guy manage to do this lighting or like make the skin look so crazy on the Mona Lisa or something, right? Of course, they studied each other's work, and of course, they copied each other, right? Which is why obviously we also copy from other games, right? Like I make no qualms of like, yeah, when we looked at the combat system for Wicked and what we want, yes, of course we were inspired by Dark Souls and by Monster Hunter and by all these games that kind of like do an animation driven combat system, right?
Yeah.
And in many ways, I hope, obviously, or not so obviously, but to me it's obvious, I hope that a lot of other studios will copy the stuff that we're doing now with Wicked, because I mean, we are doing it because we think it's the right way forward, because it makes logical sense, right? Like when the ARPG was kind of like created through Dave Brevik doing the point and click thing, like they literally went from it's a turn-based game to let's turn it real time, right? And it just made sense that he went, okay, it's a point and click thing. I click at something and my character will walk to that and then he will hit that. And now let's expand upon that, right? And then it made sense again, right? That you look at Diablo 2 and the goal is let's make everything crazier, right? Like let's just take this to another thing. But then what's hard is when do you stop supporting the thing that buttered your bread so far, right?
Yeah.
Like the switch from Super Mario World or Yoshi's Island to Super Mario 64. Do you have the guts to go 3D, right? Do you have the guts to say, hey, that thing that we have has been good, but we think there's a paradigm change up ahead, right? By making, and I do think like with the controls and with what we are doing with the more tactile combat and so on, I do like that is something that I would love see Blizzard adapt for Diablo 5 or so on, right? Because ultimately it's
hard to play Diablo right now.
That's what I feel, right? I mean, there's tons of fans of Diablo, right? And I mean, I'm one of them, right? But I do think like I don't know, like that point and click system that's the kind of thing where it's like if Diablo 3 would have come out, that they would have completely redone that system, right? I would have, like lost my shit, right? And by the way, I mean, the same thing, we've seen the same thing many times, right? Like if you look at Dark Souls, that's exactly what Castlevania could have become in 3D, right? Like if
Yeah.
you look at Castlevania and where that went and so on with the horror themes and the weapons and so on and the RPG mechanics that Symphony of the Night and so on introduced, it would have made total sense that they would have went into that direction, right? But for some reason they didn't, right? And I think it's a similar thing here. And maybe I'm off, right? That's just my feeling. But I do think it makes sense that you make the combat feel more tactile. And to some degree, I think Blizzard did that already once they did the console versions, right? They probably saw, hey, actually, like, because I'm sure you remember, right? Like before Diablo 3 came out, there was always this prevailing notion of, yeah, it's an ARPG. It will never play right on controllers, right?
Exactly. And as a controller
And then they
player,
did it.
I'm like, it can totally play controllers.
Yeah, and then they did it, and it's like, it totally works. It actually feels better on a controller than it does on mouse and keyboard in many ways, right? Because you feel more like you have more control over your character, right?
Yes.
Instead of pointing somewhere and clicking, and then the character walks over there, it's like, no, I'm actually moving the character,
Right.
which just ultimately feels more tactile, right? And so, yeah, so sorry to answer your question, right? So,
You're
um, yeah, I'm always a little scatterbrained. So I hope that that's actually the case. That Grinding Gear will copy some of our stuff, and Diablo will copy some of our stuff, because we're doing the same thing, right? Like, and then hopefully they come up with stuff that we then copy from, right? Because ultimately the goal is, what is the best ARPG that could be made? What is that sauce? What is that recipe, right?
Right.
And that's what we together kind of like have to get to, even though we are competitors in some degrees, right? But
greatness
that should be the
inspires
idea.
greatness. It's that when the rising tide raises all the ships. And so as the ball gets pushed, what we've seen, and you've alluded to this, and I've got a lot of questions, but we'll see if we can get to all of them. You've alluded to this in terms of that you were looking at the market and you're hungry. They're like, why aren't people doing this? And I think that we've seen within the market, it kind of become, risk adverse as the cost of game development has gone up and up and up. That's been the real price that the players have had to play. So it does take, I think, smaller teams who are willing and able to take those kind of risks. And when they do hit that lightning in the bottle of the moment, I think every gamer on the planet celebrates. I think those are things
I
that
think
we look
even
forward to.
industry-wise, that's something that I don't quite understand, and I also don't understand it from the Hollywood perspective, right? So, and there's something interesting going on industry-wise that I don't know, puzzles me, but I might not have all the information or something, right? But so generally speaking, right, what you have there is, I think everybody would agree at this point that AAA has some trouble, right?
Yeah.
Because the development costs have risen like crazy. Everybody assumed for some reason that COVID is the new status quo, right? And that people, like, it wouldn't go back to normal, right? And now, a lot of studios have hired like crazy, studios that were like 100 people and now 400, 500, 600 people, right? And with that, what happens automatically, right, is that, oh my God, your burn rate, like what you have to pay developers every month, shoots like skyrockets like crazy, right? And how do you get that money back? If you have like, on a Blizzard or something, on a project, they have 1,500 mouse to feed or something, right?
Yeah.
So what happens there? You need to somehow make that money back, right? But the actual costs of the games have not really changed, right? So we're still paying our $50, $60, $70 for games. But then what has changed is now you're also paying microtransactions and all of that stuff, right? And it's a really weird thing, right? It's a really, really strange thing where it's like now a lot of these studios are in that space where it's like, no, they are used now to having 300, 400, 500 people and being able to rely on that. But at the same time, you can't really sustain that development anymore because the games aren't making that much back, or it's a huge risk, right? Like, yes, you could bet on, oh, that game will become a complete outlier and will sell 10, 15, 20 million copies, but how many games do that, right? And that is really weird. And obviously also what we've seen is that, the real innovation in recent years has come from indie games, right? And indie studios, because they don't have that, they're not going to die immediately if, or it's not that big of a deal, right? If one game fails, so what, like it's not like, oh my God, you lose $200 million on it, right? So I think it's really strange. And even from the publisher perspective, there's a lot of publishers out there similar to Hollywood, right? Where they just bet on one big title, and that title, then all your fortune hangs on that title, right?
Yeah.
And it's really strange. Like it's the same with Hollywood, right? Where it's like, okay, all we're getting now with Hollywood blockbusters is here's a superhero movie, here's another superhero movie,
Right.
but you're not getting these smaller indie things anymore, right? Like you're not getting these films anymore that you saw in the 80s and 90s or so, where it's like here's a small film that was made for $15 million and it made $200 million, right? You're not really seeing that anymore in Hollywood.
The
And I
director
think
behind Blair Witch Project, because I remember when he basically, his theory was, rather than spend 10 million on one movie, I'm going to spend $1 million to make 10 movies, and maybe one of those is just an absolute hit, and that ended up being why that movie was both marketed incredibly well but also incredibly successful. So I hear what you're saying, because I agree. It feels that everything's become a little bit more safe, and I think the knock-on effect is that fatigue. We get bored. I just watched the Deadpool and Wolverine movie, really enjoyed it, and I'm coming out of it saying, yeah, this idea of superhero fatigue, I don't buy it. I think it's just bad movie fatigue that we've all been kind of, or at least mediocre movie.
No, I mean, you
fatigue.
can turn anything into gold, right? It doesn't matter if it's superhero and so on, right? Like you
Yeah.
could turn anything into gold, right? But it's just like I feel like we're getting the same stuff over and over again, right? So that
Yeah.
is true, I think, for the AAA space in gaming, and I think that is also true for Hollywood in films, right? That it's just, like you see a blockbuster and you're like, this is the same thing again, right?
Yeah.
Like I've seen this movie before. And I don't understand, even from a publisher perspective, like why would you put, 200 million, $300 million into one title and not at the least, if you can afford it, right? Like spend 20, $30 million on 5, 6 titles, and who knows, one of them could become Minecraft, right?
Right.
And could, and developers could become really crazy creative, right? Could do really insane stuff. And you would run a much less risky thing, right? It's like angel investing, for example, right?
Yeah.
Where it's just, you invest into 20 companies, you already know that 15 of them are nothing, 3 of them are maybes, and 2 of them are like, yeah, okay, they could go really big. And then maybe one of them makes you the whole money back, right? That to me seems less risky than betting my whole horse on, the next game like Suicide Squad, right? And then you lose $200 million on that game,
Dude,
right? Like, so
yeah.
I don't understand why that is a better, less risky thing than if you'd actually go more into creativity right now, right? Because it has kind of like shown itself that there have been a lot of indie games or smaller games now that have completely blown up.
Now, speaking of just creative, I really been enjoying the Crucible update, with one minor exception, and I believe this was your call. You removed XP from the
Yes.
Crucible altogether. So essentially, how has that been going? Because like, I want you guys to make the game that you want to make. But like, now that we've seen that update out in the wild for a little bit, how do you feel about that choice? Do you feel like it was the right choice, or do you think that you might make adjustments to that in the future?
We will constantly make adjustments. So there's a couple of things. Like, for example, exalting was also my idea, and I don't think that went as
really?
well as I don't
I
think that
love
went.
it. I got a
I
full
know.
I got a full exalted set, and I was like,
Yeah.
now I'm just like, I mean, the Echo Knight, I'm just burning through it, and it's been so good.
No, I understand. I understand why you love it, right? But we have to be very careful with like where is the end, and like especially now that we are. Oh, yeah, I have to be careful with the upcoming updates and so on. But very soon we'll introduce stuff where it's like, okay, well, we still want, like, ultimately we want people to kind of like just have a reason to play every day, right?
Okay, yeah.
And if we allow you to perfect items immediately, right, that could become an issue. And especially also what we're seeing telemetry wise, right, is that I think people get too used to the weapons. And by the way, the same thing is true for the Souls games or something, right? Where you pick your class at the start, and then a lot of people play through that class to the end, right? Like, hey, I play the samurai, and then they don't even change gear. They play through the entire game with like one weapon, right? And that is just, I don't think that's giving the player the right experience, right? Because, oh my God, there's so many different movesets and styles, and maybe you would prefer another one more than the starting weapon, but because you already invested into the starting weapon, that's what you stick with now. So in many of these ways, kind of like we have to be very careful and we have to tune everything and so on, right? The exalting thing was something that I wanted to try just to see, obviously a lot of people like it because it gets you to oh my god, it really bumps up my weapon again, right? But I think it gets you too close to the sky too quickly.
Okay.
um
That's fair. I was like, I really enjoyed when I got my Fierce Ring and then my band. Like, all of a sudden these things are
yes,
coming
I can
together, and I was
understand that.
like, oh yeah, let's.
I can understand it. But once you have multiplayer and trading and so on, right? Like if everybody
Oh
has
yeah.
perfect stuff,
Well,
that's
then why
that's
then why trade? Exactly. That's actually
yeah.
one of the things that was, I think, a big problem with Diablo 3 when it first launched. I have friends that made a ton of money. I actually hired them to come work for
Mhm.
me because they were automating the game in so much way because you could farm that for money. And I think essentially that was something that truly, because the reward loop was weird. It kept feeling like you'll never get the item you want. You got to engage in the economy, and then the economy will give you what you want, but that's going to take a little bit of money, and it ultimately didn't pan out. So I was just like, yeah, I think that was probably for the right call. But I felt Diablo 3 really did suffer from that original design decision going forward.
No, of course, right? Like the auction house, like I think I like the idea behind it that there's that people can trade with one another and so on, right? Because I remember the old Ultima Online days, right? Where, like, oh my God, that person got that item and it's so super rare. And then he sold it for $5,000 on eBay. The
Yeah,
idea of that, there's something nice about it, right?
I
But
agree.
there's a fundamental problem with, okay, wait, if me getting items is way easier and way more comfortable if I go through the auction house and I don't have to play anymore. And I'm kind of getting punished for playing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I'm not getting the kind of items that I see in the auction house. Your entire game falls apart, right?
Right.
Because it's like, why would I play the game if the auction house always has like better stuff than what I find in game?
And then you end up playing the
The
economy game, so it's like then you become an
Yeah,
Excel spreadsheet simulator of
yeah,
okay,
exactly,
we'll
exactly.
optimize it.
So we have Kevin Jordan in the team, who was one of the designers of the original World of Warcraft games, right until Wrath and so on. And he's always really banging the drum on, like, you have to give players loot at that moment where he's on a high, right? Like it's so much more satisfying to get loot from, like, oh my god, I finally killed that boss and it dropped that thing, versus, oh, that vendor now sells that thing and I just buy it, right?
Agreed.
So and it's the same thing with auction house or those kind of things, right? And that's also going to be really interesting with multiplayer and so on, right? Because I'm pretty sure, like right now, the whole thing is like it's free for all, right? Like people can just jump on various realms and like trade with one another, and like it's just global. And it's kind of scary to think about what that will do, right? Because immediately people will have like, oh, I found this, I have this particular item to trade, and this and this and this, right? And like people will very quickly be able to, get stuff. But
Especially content creators,
yeah, but
because like hands down you'll end up seeing people who enjoy some of its content, like, oh, I got this thing, I'm gonna go give it to
you
Asmongold
want
or something
to,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah,
It's like,
exactly,
oh, here you
yeah,
go. And it's like it becomes obviously we always joke about streamer privilege being a real thing. It's like, yeah,
yeah.
that's gonna be
Well,
a world.
it always boils down to that old problem of, like, if given the chance, players will optimize the fun out of any game, right?
Yes.
If they're given the chance through auction house or trading, right? If that is a way to make the game easier for me, I will pick it, even though I know intrinsically, right, I ruined the game for me, because, like,
Yep.
okay, now I killed this boss with 5 hits.
And
Great,
then you're going to be mad about it, and it's like, oh, this game sucks. It's like, dude, you just
Yeah,
spent
and blame the
5,000
developers,
hours.
right?
Yeah, you
Yeah,
just spent
and
5,000
blame the
hours doing
developers,
awful
but
stuff.
it was you who did it.
So I want to go back to kind of the XP question. So just a
Mm,
pet peeve of mine as a gamer, and not that you have to do anything I'm about to say, but I would really love your professional insight as to why or why not to do something like this. Once
yep.
you hit level cap, XP becomes completely useless. So I always
Yes.
think of it just hits the floor, has no value. You don't ever see it at that point. But you have perks that or disadvantages on items that punish the XP side. So those actually go up in value once you hit level cap, as opposed to, having some form of punishment to the player with whatever that disadvantage is. What would be the pros or cons in your worldview of adding in a post XP system that applies once you're at level cap that, in terms like Paragon or Final Fantasy XI's merit system coming to mind, but I always tend to think of a more modern approach as to have it not connected to power, but just as a
Mm,
little bit of a fanfare, a little bit like, hey, you did it, here's a treasure chest, and it's got some random stuff. And
mm.
like, it doesn't have to be like be all end all, but at least you have this a little bit of trickle of XP that flows into your character. What would be
Yeah.
the pros or the cons in your worldview for that kind of system in Wicked?
Well, let's start with what you originally asked, and that I still didn't answer yet, which is the removal of XP, right? Like, I
Yes.
can tell you the reason why we did it is simply because we have to look at the game as a whole, right? Like towards 1.0, not just what is the experience that players have right now, right? But also, oh my God, we have this other update coming. We have to kind of like prepare for it, right? Which is also what you're kind of seeing with Diablo 4 and
Mm-hmm.
so on, right? With all these games, where it's like actually with this next thing, we need to kind of like pull back certain things to then give you another power progression on the upcoming thing. And it's similar here, where we just felt like we don't want people to just completely over level themselves and then, oh, the new update comes out and wait, why is this so easy, right?
Ah, yes.
Elden Ring just had a similar problem with the DLC, right? Where it's like you don't know what power level the player is at, right? Like they put the like you can access the DLC at this point, right? And then, well, some players, or wait, let's be in the camera, like at this point, right? But some players are already here, and
Mm-hmm.
some players might only be here, right? So what power level is the
Mm.
expectation, right? And they got smashed pretty hard by negative reviews on like this. Why is this so difficult and so on, right? Um, and it's always a difficult thing to do, but we just looked at what is the upcoming stuff that we have going for that will come out for Wicked now, and then how does the Crucible factor in with all of this, right? Like in an ideal world, and we are not there yet, but I think we will be there. In an ideal world, what I'd want is that every single feature in Wicked has an exclusive reason for you to do,
Okay.
right? Like some exclusive thing for you to do. So with the Crucible, it would be, oh, I can, like get better gear and do this roguelite thing, so I can exalt items and do even more of these modes. And every one of those statues has like its own unique rewards. And then even with the zones, right? Like, hey, I go to the shallows to get copper, right? And then I go to Nameless Pass to get iron and so on, right? So that there's always something for you to do. And ultimately, the thing should be like it's a two-pronged approach, right? With like, I want players, and by the way, we could also talk about the timers because that goes into that.
Yeah.
I would want players to always have that feeling of like, I want to log in every day, not because we sell you stuff, right, every day or something, but because like you want to get this feeling or create this feeling of like, man, there's always something going on in the Solar Sacra, right? And there's new quests happening that didn't happen yesterday. And if I log in, I know there's new content for me or something for me to do, right?
The Destiny 2
Um,
effect, and to a degree, because every time that they released Zur on the weekend, it was always like, what's he selling? Like, let's go see what he's
exactly.
got. Maybe I want to pick it up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I would like to take that to the ultimate, right? Where it's like, okay, can we also do that with quests? Can we also do that with other things, right? Where it's like every day you log in, there's something new for you to do. Yes, some stuff might be on rotation, right? But there's like if we take that to that level, right? I would want it to be, and this is where some of that Animal Crossing thing comes in, right? Where it's like I like that feeling that in Animal Crossing, sometimes it's like I did my thing today, right? But I'll come back tomorrow, and there's a whole set of other things that I can do now, right?
Yeah.
So so it's really that, right? And like have every area, every feature have its own exclusive reason to go there, and players should have ample reasons to do everything, right? But you probably won't be able to do everything in a day, right? Um, but that should always be the idea that you go into Wicked and it's just, oh my god, there's so much to do. And so far, I mean, we only released a certain set of content. There's a lot of stuff coming that would make these systems actually fully work and give it its own, like, because some systems always need a certain breadth, right?
Yes. Right.
Like, and we're not there yet in terms of just how big the world is and how many things are already there. So some systems might be there in some way, but don't fire correctly yet. But I think that'll come. And and with XP and so on, right? We just need to make sure that the entire experience works, right? So if I think 1.0 and how will people play 1.0, I have to make sure that that works. I have to some degree also make sure that people who play early access have a good experience. And by the way, I mean, this is something that I just had a systems call with my guys. Because there is this weird conundrum of, like, so we started with, you have the tier 1 and tier 2 zones.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Crucible was our tier 3, right?
Right.
But now we will release the new zones that are tier 3. So this is where you get the silver ore and the birch and all of that stuff, right? And all of that will be easy to get, and the bear paws and blah, 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 right? All of that.
I've been like, I have to buy them from the vendor the whole time. I'm like, guys,
yes.
are there bears? And I've had people tell me there are additional chests in the Crucible, and I have never seen an additional one pop. And obviously the latest hotfix added some right with Litmus. And I was like, okay, that's great. I don't know if
there were a
people
few before, yeah.
I don't know if people are trolling me about that. Like,
no, there were a few before, actually. Yeah.
Okay, I was like, yeah, that maybe they're hidden or whatnot, but I was just like, yeah, RNG is not in my favor because I just haven't seen another one pop, and I was like, oh, interesting. Anyway, that's the
but that is the thing, right? That is the conundrum that we're in. That we have to obviously make sure, and we want to make sure that players who play right now have an amazing experience, but at the same time, well, there's certain systems planned and power progression planned and so on for 1.0, right? And through early access, obviously, we do always have the problem of like there's a certain halt period, right? That's like like we just have to, players will stay in that power level to some time, and do they still have stuff to do, right? But it would be different in 1.0, right? In 1.0, it's just I go from this zone, then to this zone, then to this zone, and right? And you don't have that kind of like loop where it's just, oh, I don't have anything to do right now,
I think there's a lot of people who are really excited about when you add in your next zone to the game, because it's that everything you've had in the game has just been fun to explore, and I really am excited. And I know I get a lot of comments from people in that vein. So speaking of that, though, this might be the first question you might not be able to answer, so just kind of giving you that heads up. Recently on Discord, you teased out the next kind of major update, and you don't want to breach anything, and I get that, but based off of what you said, it does make me speculate that you guys, from a roadmap perspective, as we wait for the new roadmap, are combining the breach and the multiplayer and I call milestone updates. Is that true, or is that something you can't answer?
Yeah, I don't want to breach anything.
Sounds good. Oh man, I'm looking forward to that, hands down. I cannot wait to see what you guys.
But those are the biggest. Those are obviously like what we're hearing fans saying, right? Is that obviously everybody is waiting for a big content expansion, right? We want a bigger world. We want more story updates. We want more bosses. We want more enemies. We want more everything, right? And we want to play together, right? Mm-hmm. So I think people are loud and clear about this stuff, and we would be stupid not to listen.
I'm very excited for that. I got a question about multiplayer, though. Y'all have talked about the work because you've teased out that it's kind of also like a fighting game in terms of your netcode because of the animation combat. Are you guys using a system like Rollback netcode as a part of that?
Yeah, so we use Quantum. We partnered with Exit Games on this right from the start, right? Because we knew, like, we were scared shitless on. We go from Ori, which is a single player game, to how do we create a multiplayer game that doesn't fall apart and that doesn't have these issues that I would say even modern games are plagued by, right? Like, I mean, if you played the Dark Souls games in PvP, I'm sure you saw the issues of like, oh my God, like, here's this guy that I'm fighting and suddenly he teleported behind me because of lag and I'm taking a backstep and I'm like, that was so unfair, like that's screwy, right? And you like the high level Dark Souls players play in a way where they actually factor in the lag and everything, right? And they actually play with it and so on. So, but we wanted something that feels smooth and that just works and so on. And obviously, like, yeah, we looked at that, hey, wouldn't it be best with an animation driven combat system that is basically like a fighting game, that we use rollback netcode, right? And use a much more modern netcode than what you usually have in those games. So yeah, everything has been built on that already. And obviously also it served us tremendously well that we are a distributed studio because we have people from all around the world. And then the goal was, okay, well, we need to make sure that they can all play together and, and without too much crazy lag and without too much connection issues
Or
and
hoops
all
to
of that.
jump through. That's one of the things that I see with modern games where, like, if you take New World, for example, you still have server queues and you pick a server. So there's a lot of coordination that goes in. There could be a lot of waiting and downtime.
Mm.
But then you take something like Destiny or even with the upcoming Blue Protocol, all that's kind of managed behind the scenes. And it just makes it easy. And I think,
So
go ahead.
I don't think we will have those issues, but don't quote me on that. But I'm hoping we won't have these issues because of how our netcode works, right? Like the way it works is that the servers that we'll have up for people, they're really just input relay servers, right? They're sending the input, and you can't really cheat it that much with like, because like you're really just sending inputs and so on. And that's it, right? So that's all the server is doing. The server doesn't run the game, doesn't run the logic, doesn't do anything. It's just literally, doing the same thing like just it's really, really simple. So I'm hoping that we won't have that, right? That we won't have the whole Era 37 thing. But who knows, right? There's so many things with multiplayer that could go wrong.
Right.
I think the one thing that also helps us is that we'll be shipping multiplayer in early access, right?
Yes.
So it's not going to be like 8 million people want to play at once all together, right?
You don't know.
So,
That would be a good problem to have if all of a sudden you're like, oh, 8 million people just jumped into early access.
well, of course, right? But at the same time, we have to, like, I think with Wicked, we kind of like really had to become humble, right? In like, oh my God, this game is so complex, right? Like making an ARPG is just stupid hard,
Yeah.
stupid complex. It was already hard to make a Metroidvania, right? And now the way this game works is like it's almost like a Metroidvania, but also there's all this RPG stuff on top and like system stuff to figure out. So we just never really make it easy for ourselves. And like then multiplayer on top and so on, it's just screwy. But sorry, I forgot the original question.
It's good. I would be curious though, because like I did ask about like a post leveling experience, like drop. Is there is there a pro or a con in your worldview to those kind of systems in ARPGs?
No, I mean I think you have to have that, right? Like we need to make sure that that ultimately what you'd want, right, is that the campaign is really just a campaign, and then that people have, like that they feel like, but that is nothing, right? Like really, I just stay here because I love playing the game, and there's still so much stuff for me to do, and it's like, oh, this is just a third of the experience, right? Like, and so on. So that's ultimately where we have to get to, right? And that's hard to do, right? To make sure that end game, all of that works, and that people like, I don't even think of end game as like, okay, there's this one thing that you have to do, right? I think of I want to think of it as like, how do we make the world feel alive? How do we make the player feel like, man, there's so much stuff to do all the time, right? And I still have that to do, and this, and this, and this, and and every day there's something else to do, and that kind of thing. Because I think you kind of like box yourself in if you think, if you think too much in terms of, oh, there's this one system that we have, right? I think it needs to be, oh, it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Or today I feel like this and then that. So I can tell you one thing that we haven't really talked about yet.
Yeah.
That would be a fun exclusive for you.
Wow.
So, for example, right? So already in the game, in Wicked, we have some areas where you see these serum statues, these ancient serum statues that are face-like, right?
Yeah.
But you can't enter them yet, right?
Oh,
and
so
that is actually the entrance to the serum sanctuaries.
okay.
And the serum sanctuaries, we always wanted to do something there where it's like, okay, well, let's make sure the overworld stuff is not just combat, right? So the initial idea was that we'll have like puzzle elements in there and so on, right? And ultimately now kind of like we decided, like, hey, we should use the farming systems for that.
Oh, okay.
And that sounds really weird at first, right? But it's this whole thing of like, it would be really fun to kind of like have these Zen gardens out there, right? And then if you make them beautiful, right? Like if you almost like a little, Japanese shrine or something, right? Where it's like, you have to make this thing beautiful, but then you get a crazy buff, right?
Oh, that's
and
great.
that's just one of the things that you can do, right? Like, hey, if I plant these things here and and really dive into that. Like, you don't have to do it, right? It's completely optional, right? Like, you don't have to do it. But it's just one of those things that you could encounter in the world, right? Like, so as you run through the world, oh, I could do this. Oh, I could do that. Oh, there's a Sam Sanctuary. Oh, I actually have all the stuff with me. So I'm going to do the Sam Sanctuary now, because now I'll get this buff that lasts me, for the next couple of days or something. And that's going to be really useful for me, right? And my group and so on. So that's something, that's the kind of thing that I'm really excited about, we should be able to create that feeling of every day I go log into Sacrament and Isola Sacra, right? There's so much stuff for me to do. And even beyond main campaign, right? That is the goal. That's just, wow, like every day, let me do this, or next day I want to do this. And then the next day, oh, but now I'm going to do a bunch of this, like that should be the idea.
You mentioned earlier this year, you asked about realm modifiers. And that kind of leads me right from what you were just talking about, where, oh, I can get this crazy buff. But I could see within just the general gaming community around this game, you could see hardcore modes, you could see all these different things. When it comes down to those kind of modifiers, what degree would you be willing to kind of break that up? I like, if you look at Pal World, for example, they let you control so much about every little aspect of the game. Obviously, they're a survival RPG. You could see modifiers of adding in survival, RPG to Wicked. Obviously, maybe not the base package, but what level of freedom are you hoping that the players can start creating their own content around this
well,
game?
now we're basically getting to the whole should we have an easy mode discussion, right?
Oh, no.
Right. So here's the thing, right? So regarding the realm modifiers and all of this stuff, right? I do think we always think in terms of like player retention, right? And like just replayability, right? Can I challenge myself? Like, does the game officially support something that is like, for example, I used to play a ton of Zelda on the Super Nintendo, right? A Link to the Past.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm pretty good at Zelda games, so I always kind of like challenged myself, right? With just, hey, can I play through Zelda 1 with just 3 hearts and without picking up the sword, right? Or can I play through A Link to the Past without picking up any hearts and, play in a certain way, right? And I like that we now see more games officially support that stuff, right? Where it's like, if I really love a game already, that I don't have to just make up kind of like a challenge for myself, right? But that the game actually rewards you in some way, right? That it's like, this is officially supported. You can play that way. And then just to top it off, the cherry on top of the sundae would be, and that's the only way you get that certain thing, right? And I think that is really, really interesting, because it just gives people who already played the game a ton, who already enjoyed the experience, right? Just a way of like, hey, I'm playing Wicked on the weekend, but I can play it in a way that I've never played it before, right? By turning on these modifiers and doing that. Now, the other problem that you have with that is, okay, can I also make the enemies easier or remove the challenge and so on? And then we're back to, but what you would see is, if we do that, right, is that the game is not really all that fun if the challenge is not there, right? If I would allow you to one-shot every single enemy, right, it's just like you're running through and you're back to the open world problem, right, where it's just, but there's nothing that we throw at you, right? It's like, imagine playing a platformer where there's no gaps in the floor and you just run through empty levels, right? That's what you get there. That's, by the way, I mean, I'm pretty sure that's why Miyazaki, for the Souls games, right, never really went for easy mode and so on, because there's a certain experience that you're crafting and you're spending so much time as a developer making sure that experience works for as many players as possible, right? And it's really fun for you. And then you just hope, well, if it's really fun for me, let's hope it's fun for millions of people out there, right? That kind of thing, right? And so we have to be careful with that. There's a plan we have for, what are the things that we would allow people to modify, and what are the things where we feel like, no, you would really remove the fun of the game if we would allow you to change this and that. But officially supporting these kind of things where people would like to challenge themselves, or like play the game in a different way, I think that's interesting. I think we have enough stuff in the game that you could even do things like, oh, we'll introduce more survival elements, right? And then you could play Wicked as like almost like a survival game. I think those things would be interesting, but we have to see. And then hardcore mode, obviously, like I kind of have confirmed this already anyway, but that is also coming for sure, right? Simply because it's a fun mode. It's
Is that a
a
1.0
classic.
thing, or is that something for early access, do you think?
Well, we have it already. It's working. It's there. We have it all set up. It's just a matter of when are we gonna drop it?
So yeah, I guess that's good to hear, because if you already have it already, then it's about polish and finding the right
Right.
time.
I
That'll
mean,
be
it's
fun.
not like super polished yet. There's a little bit of UI stuff that we'd like to do. There's a couple of bugs that we saw there, right? But initially, we wanted to actually release that with the Crucible update.
Oh,
But then, yeah, so for the Crucible update, we were like, um, we really have to just polish the Crucible, and that's what people expect, right? So if there's any bugs or something in hardcore mode and we just screw ourselves, we also don't want to kind of like throw people into crazy crunch all the time, right? So we just said no, we're gonna cut this for now, right? But we have it, it's there, it's cool, you can play it and it's good. But then that's also the early access conundrum that we're in right now, right? With like, okay, so when do we release it? Because a lot of people are like already like, oh, why did you not just release all the crazy content that takes a lot of time to build already, right? Why did you do the Crucible, right? Nobody wants the end game mode. And if we now come out with like, oh, how about hardcore, right? Like, I think people wouldn't feel felt hurt by us. Um, but obviously it's coming, right? Like, so that's gonna be really fun. It's gonna be fun to see streamers approach it, try it, right? Because the death rate in Wicked, from what we see telemetry wise, is infinitely higher than in a typical Diablo or ARPG.
I do have one request. You can feel free to table this, put this on the backlog. But I played baseball. Baseball is a sport that I just, from a statistical perspective, I nerd
Yep.
out. This lefty versus this guy on a rainy day. This is what the result. Like, it's as I guess Smash Brothers is also a really good example of like just nerding out on various different stats, whether it's a bestiary or any kind of stats. Y'all have teased out through social media this number of times of falling death, this number of that. Is there any way we could get some of our personalized stats in the game that we can nerd out about, at especially as a content creator and a streamer, when someone's like, how many times has he died? Here we go. It's like too
I think
many.
that's a great idea. Yes, I think that's actually a really great idea. Yeah, I think that's a really, really great idea, and we should probably do that. We
Like
did
if you're
that, by the
tracking
way,
it,
for
like how like
Ori. Of course, we're tracking everything, right? But we did that actually for Ori, because Ori was also a game that was a little bit on the difficult side. Um, and what we saw though as well, right, was that we had the kill counter in the menu, and a lot of people were like, "Oh my god, this fucking game! I died like 600 times," right? So it can also be a little bit disparaging, right? But yeah, if you want to see your stats or something, right, in the menu, I do think that would be really, really cool to just, like see exactly, here's how many enemies you killed, and here's how many this and that, and da da da, and how much damage you deal on a thing.
Well, and also then you break it out. You can break it up by weapon, and there's so many little.
Yeah,
Again, like I just kind of nerd out about those various
yeah.
different things, and it's something I find enjoyable. Speaking of Ori, that's actually one thing I've never played, and
Mhm.
but I've been, by playing this game and getting exposed to Moon Studios, a lot of people have been saying I should go and play it. So I'm gonna let you know. I'm gonna sit down and find some time with my kids to
We
go and
should.
play through Ori. And
Oh, I don't know if I would play it with your kids. So
oh,
it's
what
cool, right?
age?
But
I have a bunch of kids, so we
the
have a
only
gamut.
reason now the only reason why I'm saying that is because it can be kind of tough. Like, so with Ori, I also story wise, right? Like, I don't think we did the things in Wicked yet. Like, I think we have a good foundation that we shipped so far, but the story is going to become really crazy, right? And we want to take it to that level where it's almost Game of Thrones like back then,
Ooh,
right? Like
yeah.
when Game of Thrones was crazy, where you don't know who we're gonna kill off, and all these NPCs, like, you should actually feel something for them, right? And we want to make sure that like, we tell an epic saga, right? And that by the end, when we are done with the entirety of No Rest for the Wicked, that everybody had their character arcs played out, right? And everybody had their, um, trials and tribulations that they went through, right? And that you just never know what we're gonna do next with the story, right? Like, who do we keep alive? Which faction survives, which doesn't, and who betrays whom, that kind of thing. And so with Ori, a lot of times, like what we did is we tried to kind of like tell an allegorical tale, right? But that was very human, right? So we used these
Mhm.
fantasy creatures, but in reality, it's a very, very human story, right? Like, so you play this forest spirit, but at the same time, you have things in there that are, like just very human things, right? Like it's all about family, love, and um, it's a coming of age tale, right? And so with Blind Forest, for example, like the very first thing is that we used a little bit of the Disney trope, right? Where we connect you to Ori's mother, right? And have that first moment of like, hey, we bond the two together. And then she starves to death, basically, right? In front of you, right? So I had this a couple of times that if people play it with like their 4 or 5 year old kids, right? That is just, it's too much for them.
Maybe my 10-year-old. That sounds, maybe that might be more of her alley. We've been going through the Lord of the Rings. That's why when you've made kind of parallels to what your vision of
Right.
1.0 being the Fellowship of the Ring, it's
Mhm.
been a real treat because those are some of the stories that really I think are timeless. And it ends up being something that is just like, yeah, oh, you're right. Like 1.0. Now, oh, what are they going to even do next? What's their two towers moment? And then it just becomes
Right.
like that excitement that builds up on it. But one thing you've alluded to in the past, and I don't know if there's any real plans about this, is that we're in early access, but you've even thought about opening up early access, is what I'd be calling it, to allow people to come in and play, preview builds of what you guys are currently testing. Is there any updates on that, or is there any plans that are actually being formulated, or is that just something that y'all want to do sometime in the future?
Well, I mean, we thought about this especially for multiplayer, right? To make sure that, we get some early feedback already from certain people that try multiplayer and then have them play together and already give us a bunch of, because that is, we are very, I wouldn't say scared, right? But we have a lot of respect of
Cautious.
like
Yeah.
cautious of like making sure that our multiplayer launch actually works. And because you've seen so many times in the industry that it's just, hey, there's this game coming out, there's multiplayer, and just, oh yeah, you can play it for a week because the servers just crashed and everything, and
Yeah.
stuff doesn't work and the balance doesn't work, or whatever, right? So yeah, we do think that would be interesting. But we haven't really fully figured out yet exactly kind of like how would we go about that and why. I do think it's interesting, kind of like just generally the whole early access thing for our studio is extremely interesting because you get so much feedback, so much data, and a lot of love from the community, also a lot of hate from the community. But
If you're
um,
not being
just
loved and hated, you're not succeeding. That's the lesson I've learned over my life. And we're roughly the same age. So it's like, yeah, when you're doing something unique, you're going to get it from both sides. And if no one's
yeah,
talking about you in a like then you're not doing
then
anything
it doesn't
worthwhile.
work. Yeah,
Yeah, then it's
yeah.
nothing's working.
So but that to us is really great, right? Like, so just seeing how many people are interested in the game or already think, oh my god, like this could be a really great game, and we only released so little so far, right? That to me is really interesting, right? That they're already kind of like speculating what will happen next and what update is coming out and so on. And ultimately that's always what we wanted to do with Ori to some degree, right? But we always had, Ori was always kind of like a one and done game,
Mm-hmm.
but we like almost like fire and forget, right? Like you release it on one date, right? And then the game is what it is at that date, right? And yeah, we were able to make some updates, hot fixes, whatever, but you can never really then go in because the greatest moment, especially you, if you haven't released a game yet as a developer, right? The greatest moment you will ever have as a developer is when you release the game and you see people actually playing it and you see their faces and you
Yeah.
see how they react and comment on it and so on, right? That's the highest high that you can get as a developer. Um, but then it's also a really low point when you see like something really doesn't quite work or it doesn't fire in the way that you hoped it would, right? Um, and then, well, you're not able to go in and make adjustments, right? Like your baby has been ripped from you, right? Like it's now in college, and there's so much I could have done.
I think
That's
that's
gonna
that's a very true parallel to just being a parent because it's like, all right,
yes,
when they're young, invest in them. And I always tell my wife,
yeah,
it's like if once they turn 18, if they want to go be stupid, at least
yeah,
I gave them every opportunity not to be. And then, it's like that's going to be on them at that point. But you're right, like they're out in the wild. You know,
But it is fascinating now, right? Like going from games that were just shipped and then, yeah, there's some fixes and so on, but the game is what it is at that point, right?
yeah.
Go to actually talking to the community, right? And like hearing, hey, what do you guys think, right? Like what would be interesting to add, right? Like would you be excited about this or that? And then just having that back and forth and so on, right? That is super fascinating. And that ultimately, I mean, I hanged myself out of the window a little bit with that, right? But ultimately, if you really want to perfect something, you will not get there without that feedback. And especially the more complex games become, if you don't do some kind of early access, right? Like we did it before with Ori with just user research, right?
Mhm.
But if you wouldn't have run user research, like if you just only test your own product, right? And you don't actually look at, well, how do players actually play it, right? Um, I don't think it's likely that you're going to release a game that works for as many people as we hope our games work for, right? Um, so we did it with user research before, but a game of the complexity of Wicked, I don't think could be done without a huge public beta or that kind of thing. Which is why like Blizzard constantly does it, right? Like you have to have a huge beta, public, private beta, whatever, before the game actually ships. Because unless you have that data, you just don't know. Like you can't measure it on your development team because they know everything, right? They
Mhm.
know
Yeah.
exactly how the story should flow. They play the game a certain way with a certain set of expectations. It's very hard to get fresh blood in, even if you already did friends and family testing at some point. There's like, this is a one and done thing, right? And then the next time you do friends and family testing, it's the same people and they already know the stuff. They already know what the expectation is and so on, right? So, but once people play it, it's like it's a completely, like these people are untouched, right? It's a completely fresh thing for them. And so that is super super fascinating, and I'm learning a lot. And like just generally being able to react to people and just make them happy by like hearing, oh, wouldn't it be great to have this in Wicked? And meanwhile you're like, yeah, that's coming. It's the coolest.
That I have to say, y'all have done a really good job, especially when it comes down to communication. And if nothing else, like it's, I always tell people they don't. I'm just going to put out the idea, and they can choose to reformulate it or whatever, as long as it's adhering to their vision. But at least they're communicating, and they y'all have have both been open and and taking in that, but then also communicating various different things. So it's been fun to watch that process play out because it feels like this is a dialogue. And that's why I say, like, people ask me if you should play. I was like, I like early access, and this is perhaps the best early access game I've participated in because it feels like we're having a real conversation, even though you and I right now are having a real conversation. But even through Discord and before this, it's like, oh, yeah, they are paying attention. They are listening
Yeah.
to what's being said. And then they're making a decision. And that's what we want as players. We want them to take in all of these different voices and then figure out what is the true or what's going to be working well with the balance of the game itself. But I do have a question because you talked about this in the kind of your little Discord Q&A today. When asked about transmog, you said that that's currently not being planned. I'm going to say this as a gamer. I hate transmog systems, and I'm an odd duck when it comes down to it because I know how popular they are. But I always
Yeah.
get the old school gamer in me gets frustrated when I hear fashion is the true end game with these kind of games,
Mm.
and so you do what you do, but you have said that you're currently no plans to add in a transmog
Yeah,
system.
we don't.
Is there any like from a developer perspective? Is there a reason? Is that just a massive amount of
Oh, of
time?
course, there's a reason. Like if you make a decision like that, right? There's a huge reason behind it. So, for example, right, like so we have different weight classes
Mm-hmm.
and that actually has a pretty big effect on what
Gameplay,
gear
yeah.
you're wearing and so on. Has a pretty big effect on gameplay in general, right? Um, and so how would you break it down then, right? Like so we want to make sure that, for example, if you play PvP, right,
Mm-hmm.
that that if you suddenly another player appears in the arena, right, that what now he's wearing light armor and your expectation is okay, so he's light, but in reality he's heavy, right, and so on. Um, that is really confusing, right? And then also just generally, like I think it breaks the thematic a bit, right? It makes the like I think there is something nice about people kind of like finding out which sets fit together visually, and then also just in terms of the stats that they need and so on. Um, but it's mostly that. It's like, because we have this kind of like weight system and your build matters, right? Um, the whole transmog thing, I understand that, like, people want the fashion thing and so on, and we will do certain things that head into that direction, that give them more options regarding customization. But the transmog thing, I think, just overrides the choice you made.
Yeah.
And that is something that I'm always really careful about, right? Like, so for example, I was really not a huge fan of um when at Blizzard they decided with Diablo 3, right, that, oh, there's no attribute points anymore, and you can just quickly look up, like, what is this build? Okay, well, I just go into the menu and like click, click, click. Now I have that build as well, right? And in Diablo 2, it was like, no, I had to build that character, right? Like, it wasn't, I can't just go to the menu and like just click 5 things and that's it, right? And I listened to the explanation of the game designer for that thing, right? But I never understood it. Like, I thought that was really weird, a really weird explanation to give. Like, so basically, his whole breakdown was, oh, people just look up build guides and then just put the points where the build guide says, and so that's a really shit system, right? But then I don't think the solution to that is, well, you just don't have any character build anymore, right? Like, the solution to that would have to be, yeah, just give them more, more variety in those choices and so on, right? And not have everybody, go for the same builds and so on. But that I don't quite like, right? Like, I want people to really feel proud of the characters that they built, and of how they upgraded Sacrament, and how they built their house, and all of that stuff, right? Like, that is something that I felt with earlier ARPGs, right? That you invested 15, 20, 25 hours into your character, and that was just one character, right? And then now I'm going to build a mage, and I know it's going to take me 20, 30, 40 hours, right? But I'm proud of that character after, right? And so if you remove that and you just have, yeah, I can just completely respec for free, and then, like, I turn my huge, heavy, great sword strength character into a mage, it just ruins that illusion and that achievement, And it's the same thing with the easy mode thing, right? Where it's like, there needs to be a certain thing, right? Where it's like, well, if players can just change the dials, then where's the sense of achievement, right?
I agree.
And I think that for an RPG is super important, that you feel like you built something, which also goes to Sacrament and those kind of things, right? Ultimately, with Sacrament, we want to do is that Sacrament feels like a character, right? Like building a character in an RPG, that it has that kind of level of diversity and like progression and so on to it. And clearly we're not there yet, but that's what I ultimately want to be. And I think that is what role-playing games to me are about, right? That it feels like I am building something, I'm investing something, and then I am proud of that character that I built, because I built it, I went through hell and back to do that, right? I killed all these enemies and so on, but look at that character I have now, and then now I'm smashing everything,
Speaking of magic, you brought up a mage build. I've been currently leveling a mage build. So I am level 16 as of today. And it's, mages, I always kind of felt like if you want a game, an RPG to be harder, play a mage. But then ultimately you become that glass cannon where you have enough tools and enough aspects to it. When we talk about magic and mages in No Rest for the Wicked, you've already alluded that some big changes are on the way. You're smoking a pipe right now. You've already teased out that there's going to be pipes that the mage can puff, which I'm personally looking forward to as somebody who wants more ways of gaining focus that that I don't currently have access to in my current build. When all that's being said and done, you've also talked about elements and kind of it's seemingly being connected with an elemental rework or something with the weapons and dealing with elements. Like, I'm filling in kind of gaps in your answers, and so correct me where I get it wrong. But
well, I can just tell you, we were very unhappy with how the elementals worked out for early access. We really just had to put that together fairly quickly because we ran out of time. And so what we have right now is okay, but it's not amazing, right? So where I'd like to be is that, you know, if I play a fire mage, that plays one way. If I play a lightning mage, that's a completely different play style. If I play a plague mage, right, like that's a completely different play style, and so on. If I play a faith build, it plays like this. Obviously, that's where we have to get to, right?
Yeah.
That it all feels completely unique, but we just didn't have the time. So right now, there is a lack of uniqueness to all of that, right? Like I don't like the whole thing of like, well, the fire mage throws a fireball and the ice mage throws an ice ball, right? I
Right.
think that needs to be way, way, way cooler, right? That it's like, oh my god, there's a plague mage and he does this kind of crazy stuff, right? And it totally fits into his fantasy. So yeah, that's absolutely one of the things that we 100% want to rework.
That's something I'm really looking forward to. Question though about the elements, because you have 4 elements with fire, ice, lightning, and plague. Are there any plans to maybe introduce water, wind, and maybe some kind of like divine or holy kind of version to kind of offset to kind of be another part of the wheel?
Not at this point. Obviously, who knows, right? Like we can only see so far,
Mm-hmm.
right? But not at this point. The first goal has to be, let's make sure that the elemental stuff that we have right now is perfect and feels amazing, and we cover as much gameplay space as possible with that. And then if we still feel like after that, oh my God, there's another thing that we could introduce that does all of these things, then great, then let's do that, right? But for example, right, like if we get all the elemental stuff to work the way I think it should, then one of the next things that I think could be really cool is that we do more summoning, right? Like playing a necromancer or something like that. That would be really cool.
That's my next question, because you've also teased out that Necromancer as a goal of yours for 1.0, right? So we're talking, when I think of 1.0, maybe next year. I don't know. I'm not going to hold you guys to a 2025 launch. We're not Ashes of Create. People have been telling me Ashes of Creation's been going to be coming out since 2020, and I'm like, all right, I think you guys need to adjust your timetables. But that being said, what is the difficulty that maybe you can help everybody kind of understand? Because with the Necromancer or any kind of pet class, which you've kind of teased out a little bit already, that you have train traversal, so you have pets that have to kind of be aware and all of that. What level of investment in terms of time is that for you guys? Like, is it
Oh,
gonna?
there's ton. Doing something like Necromancer means, okay, now you need to have pathfinding, and they need to be able to traverse the environment, right? Like, and so it also screws with with the way we design levels, because we want these super vertical levels where players have to go over balance beams and like climb ladders and climb a rope, or can climb up multi stages, right? And it's like, okay, so how does that work with the Necromancer, right? Can the will the skeleton suddenly climb the ladder with me and like balance over beams and that, right?
How are your
So
animators
and just
liking that? Because it's like
yeah,
the easiest solution is just like, oh, and they just teleport, they just show up wherever you end up. But if you made it
yeah, but
really,
that's always there's always the cheap thing, right? Of like, do we go for the cheap option where they just teleport and so on, right? And maybe, right, maybe that's the only way to do it. But that is something that I would love to look into, right? Like, can we support that somehow? Can we do an ally? Like, we already have an ally system. We're not really using that yet, but we do have that. But right now we don't have a system that can do, like proper pathfinding and would traverse through the levels without being annoying or weird and so on. But that would be something that I would love, right? Because in ARPGs, usually I love my necromancers. Um, that would be amazing. And just the idea in general, like as a class, that you don't fight yourself, or like not that much, right? That you just have, hey, I'm casting these things and they fight for me, right? And I'm just standing back there and go, ha ha ha, like, and another enemy is dead and so on. That I really, really love, but it's a difficult design problem, and a lot of times we're doing the stuff where it's just, well, you know, difficult design problems are really fun to solve. So
yeah. You've alluded also to a lot of different class fantasies, that you want this game to be flexible and allow for a lot of freeform fantasies to be built in. We talked about Necromancer. Like, immediately, I think my hunter would be awesome to be able to have some kind of pet that was alongside me if I chose to have that in my build. But then the question is that if you guys considered anything regarding like maybe like a druid. One of the things that's really cool about those is obviously like with shape shifting and more, that's an animation problem for sure. But like, is that something that might be on the horizon for 1.0, or is that something, you know, further out if you guys decide to bring in some kind of concept like
Well,
that.
with the plan that we have with Wicked, right? With a lot of these things, it's just a matter of when, not if, right? So, ultimately, we'd like to do something where, like we'd like to create the kind of game that we always wanted to play that just fulfills everybody's RPG fantasies, right?
Yeah.
And that's hard to do, right? So if somebody wants to play like a ninja, they should be able to play that way, right? If somebody wants to play a paladin, great. If somebody wants to play like a barbarian, like He-Man or Conan or whatever, right? Cool, let them play that way, right? And then it goes even further to, well, what if I want to play the game, especially now with multiplayer and all this stuff, right? What if I want to play almost like a merchant, right? Where my whole thing is, I want to play the game like like an economy sim or something, right? Like where I go grab these resources so nobody else can get them, and then I sell them for extra high prices in my town and my shop in Sacramento, right? Um, that would be really, really cool. Or if I just become the lumberjack of the town, right?
Mm-hmm.
If somebody just has a comfort game, right? Like, hey, I play with my buddies, and one of the buddies isn't a super hardcore gamer, but he just loves sitting down and go out and cut some trees and do a little bit of this or that, or like making sure that, hey, people can play it with, if you're something other um loves, like just playing with you a little bit, right? Like isn't a super hardcore gamer, but still has a, like, oh, I could do some tasks here and it's fun and I spent that time with my husband or something, right? That would be really cool, especially like that I would really like, right? That is just a place for everybody, right? Like that Sacrament and Wicked is just, hey, everybody could join in. Or if you play with your kids, right, that one of your kids could be just, oh, I like collecting stuff, so they collect stuff, right? Or that kind of thing, and
That's
you
been
play
my
with them.
yeah, that's been my goal as a content creator. My kids currently are not revenue producing, and at some point I need to like, guys, I gotta go to work, guys. I need some materials. Y'all get on that, like as a part of their homework. Get your homework done, and now you're gonna go grind for daddy so that when he gets off work, he's ready to get going. I always joke about that. It's like, yeah, I've been making my own bots for years. They're just not online yet. We're still working on getting them trained up and all that good stuff. You've teased out obviously skill trees as a way of kind of then changing up builds along with the other systems that you already have in place. But you've also described that as major heart surgery. Are
Mhm.
skill trees like, are you targeting that for like 1.0 when the game is fully released, or is that something that you want to get into the hands of the early access players as soon as it is actually ready for hands on?
Yeah, well, we'll have to see. So where we are on the talent trees is, we basically we listen to all the feedback. We listen all the time to everything that people post, right? We're the kind of crazy people um, where we look at all the YouTube videos and then we actually look at all the comments and so on, right? And we collect all the stuff and so on, just so we know exactly, well, what does the community at large think. And so one of the things that did come up, especially early on, is that people miss a little bit of that leveling. Like, is the leveling as satisfying as it could be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because right now, here I leveled up and then I get to put points into attributes. But that what that does is it basically just unlocks your gear choices, right? Like now I can wield a really heavy greatsword,
Mm-hmm.
and could put these runes in it and so on, right? But in an ideal world, right, just the actual leveling your character should feel as deep as any other system that we have in the game, right? That it's right now a lot of that, a lot of what your build is about just basically comes from the gear, right? But not necessarily through your actual choices in terms of attributes you picked or talents, blah blah blah, right? And so that is something that we've been discussing. We've been like we have design, um but again, like it's major heart surgery. It would have to affect multiple things, right? Like tons of things if you want to do it right, that is right. If you just want to throw a small thing in, like, oh, here's a talent tree, it gives you small little buffs, and like that paragon system thing, right, where it's like,
Yeah.
oh, this will make you 0.01% better. Who cares, right? Like that, I don't want to grind for that. I don't feel like that's great. But it would have to be something where it's like, okay, it really, like, here's one strength build, it plays this way. Here's another strengths build. It used different talents in the talent tree, so it plays completely differently, right? You would want that ultimately. So we'll have to see. I can't really make any promises right now because it is like, if we want to do it right, it's a major rework. So it's still being debated. We kind of like, have to see.
It's like, as you described it, I was like, that's a lot of work. I'm not anticipating that anytime soon, but it would be interesting. I think what you have with the stats and everything is really kind of fun, with the minor exception that I feel like the different stats that you use for like faith and intelligence, they don't have like a knock-on effect. And so that's something that I would like, whether you go skill trees or whatever, that it's like, yeah, it'd be neat to see if strength had some level of impact on what you could carry, right? So it's like, yeah, it's not 1-to-1. I don't think like, because you still want people to have to choose to invest in.
We actually had that, by the way. Like,
Oh.
we actually did have exactly that system before, like a year or so before we launched or something, right? But the problem with that is also always is just how much rope do you give players to hang themselves, right?
Yeah.
And so, a lot of players kind of like made choices like, hey, I put 5 points into strength, and then 7 points into intelligence, and then 4 points into dex, and now you have a character that's like, dude, this is a total garbage build, and you can't equip any of the stuff. You're like, hey, I got the tier 2 gear now, but I can't equip any of it, and so on. And so ultimately, even if you have systems like that, right, with like, oh, he has a knock-on effect, a lot of times what you have is, but that's not a good build. It's just, it's not, right? Like, and so we try to make it very clear, kind of like, through the stats and so on, like what actually makes sense for your class, right? But I think ultimately what you'd want is not just that. I think a lot of people are very accepting of what we have right now because it's similar to what the Souls games did and so on. But I think ultimately the ultimate goal would be, there should be a talent tree, or the leveling, the choice that you get to make it leveling and the actual character progression matters just as much as your gear choice. And that's clearly not the case right now.
I'm looking forward to whatever that ends up shaking out. On that, kind of a follow-up, when you talk about the stat screen, then there's lots of different perks that you can get on weapons, positive, negative, all that stuff on your gear. Would it be possible to bring some of that into the stat screen where it would like total, like you've got 30%, weight reduction total? Like, here are the
absolutely
perks.
100%.
Yeah, because that's one of the things I'm
100%.
like, all right, like what is this? Is this, and does this even stack? And you guys recently took away the stacking rings, and honestly, I want to thank you for that. I think that does mean more variety, and it does actually change the value of rings, because I was like, great, now I have to make a choice here. But it would be great to know, like, oh, I've got a 20% damage increase here. I've got, that stacks with this other thing that I've got going over here, especially when it says percentage.
It's always one of those unpopular things that you have to do, right, with balance and RPGs and so on. So because, some people had like, oh, I have 3 fierce rings, right? And now, oh, great, now you have like, 80% more damage or something, right? And it's just, no, ultimately you will have more fun if you actually have to make really difficult choices, right?
Yes.
If it's really like, which one do I use, right? Because I can't use 3 of the same thing, and that just explodes the balance. I ultimately, you would always want that every turn, right? Everything that the player has to do is always an interesting choice, and it always hurts a little, right? Like every single thing is like, I can make this choice, but like, then I need to do this or that, right? So that was that, right? But it's always a little bit unpopular, right? Whenever we fix anything that is like, okay, this is too much, right? There will be people who are like, why did you nerf my class? Like, and
of course,
ultimately it's for the better of the game, right? Ultimately it's because, hey, we have a lot of stuff coming, and we want to make sure that ultimately the balance actually works the way we'd like it to.
Excellent. Do you have I know we've been going for an hour and a half. Do you have a little bit of time to answer some of my community's questions that they sounded off with before we wrap up?
Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
I just want to be respectful because I know it's later for you. Well, I mean, it's not really a question, but Lag writes, tell them thank you. So the community that is around this game, they just want you to know that we were having a really good time. So I figured that
is sweet. So absolutely right, but thank you, right? Like, so if you thank me, you're probably a player of the game, and I couldn't be more grateful, right, that you guys decided to jump in already in early access and provide feedback and so on. So thank you back.
Leroy writes, "Are there any new game modes being released in the future after the Crucible?" And I think they intend to say, like, I know you have different modes within the Crucible, but is there another kind of like design or system like Crucible that's also going to be in the
Yes,
game later? Yes. All
yes,
right.
and the Crucible will get extended also very heavily, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you, I mean, what we have planned for the Crucible, right? Like the Crucible should just be this draining ground, right? Where it's just, okay, well, here's the roguelite mode, right? And then the really interesting thing for me as a developer with the Crucible is also, or with Wicked in general, right? Is that here's a game where I can do so much. I can combine so many things together, right? Like, for example, I always wanted to make a Harvest Moon kind of like farming game, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now I can do that within Wicked, right? Or it would have always been fun to do a roguelite, and now I can do that within Wicked and so on. So it's kind of like it's the gift that keeps on giving, right? And even during the very early prototype days, I can tell you that I don't know if I told this already before, but even in the early prototype days, um, I played, what was it called? Um, I played one of the tower defense things, right? And was like, oh, that could be fun if it's character based, right? Because a lot of these tower defense
Mm-hmm.
things are like, oh, you just have to click on where that tower should be built and so on, right? And then I had this whole thing of like, but what if there's level design and you actually have to run from tower to tower and like actually be fast and all of that. And so I did that and prototyped that, and it was just super fucking fun. It was just, if you're into these kind of styles of games, then I mean, it was just super fun. It just added a whole new element to that, similar to how we, introduced way more platforming into a Metroidvania, right? I did that there, and like something like that would be really cool. Or like one of the things um, that we already teased is uh, one of the statues in the Crucible will very much be about like that survivor style gameplay, right? Where it's
Mm-hmm.
just hordes and hordes of enemies swarming in while you kill them, right? And then that gives you something, like that gives you some traces and so on. And then you have to, get some more boons and so on. But then there's more enemies coming in that are even harder and so on. So all of that just makes total sense, right? Like total sense.
You also answered Dirt Rabbit's question because he asked, "Is there a wave-based tower defense Crucible mode in your mind?" And
Yes,
and I
there
was
you
like,
go.
"Yeah, there you go." Like that was like right out. I was like, "Oh, that was intentional," but that's awesome. You also talked about, just to kind of talk a little bit more Crucible, about prayers, like as a way of then also still modifying the existing
Yes.
game in and of itself. Is that Is that going to be around the corner, or is that future plan? Future plan.
We'll have to see. There's right now we're all so busy with the upcoming update that we planned it all out. We have a roadmap that gets us all the way to 1.0. We know what the beats are and so on, right? And we know where this would happen, but we also want to be able to move things, right, and be a little bit flexible. Because I'll give you one example, right? If the PvP update drops, right, and PvP becomes a really big thing,
Mm-hmm.
then we want to be able to support that, right? If the community then tells us, oh my God, we need new arenas, right? And we're like, well, but that's not on the plan,
Yeah.
haha, then that's stupid, right? Like we need to then be able to say, yes, of course, like we'll get you new arenas. And we'll probably take something away from some other thing then, right? Or deprioritize something here. So wait, now I forgot the original thing. Sorry, it's already like 11:38. My brain is fried. I
Yeah,
also had a
I get it.
two-hour
My
call right
bedtime's
before that.
usually at 9. I do stand-up comedy, and I was doing that last night. And one of my jokes was like, "It's clearly past my bedtime."
But what was the original question again?
We were talking about the Crucible and then the wave base enhancements that you've already got planned for the game, and then I asked. Now I forgot because it's been a
There
day.
you go.
I get up at 4 just because that's
Dude,
how
we're old men.
old man loving games is what it is. We talked about the prayer system and how you talked about
Oh,
that.
there you
Yeah,
go. There
yeah.
you
I
go.
got it.
There
I
you go.
figured it out.
Yes.
Saved it.
So yeah, with the prayer stuff, right? Like so the the whole idea was always, we want to do that kind of like, what Hades does, the heat modifiers or something, because it's just fun, right? That's just betting on yourself, right? Like, oh, can I be cocky and do that with like half health, right? Or only use this weapon, or play through it naked, or do that kind of thing. And then, as you raise the stakes, the rewards go up, right? So that kind of stuff is definitely on the list and is coming.
Yeah, and that kind of also answers another question that Leroy had about opportunity for player-made content, and that's just ways and things that you can go and play the game in different ways. So I think that's really cool. Havoc J writes, with the current story content being relatively short, will the next update be a considerable move forward with the plot?
Yes.
There we go.
Yeah. Very much so.
Are there plans to also allow more crafting recipes for weapons, armor sets that are in the game already, like in a way to display them maybe in your player house?
Yeah, so the whole crafting thing, we have to... I mean, let me ask you, right? So right now we have this exclusivity thing where certain items are only sold at vendors, right? Certain items only drop, certain items are only craftable. And it's all unique, right? And one of the things that we've always been debating, and we're going back and forth on it, is should ultimately all items be craftable, right? That's the thing. Like, do we make them exclusive so that it feels like, okay, that thing only exists there, and if you get it, oh my god, right? Or ultimately, should it all be craftable, right? Should there be blueprints for everything? And
my answer to that question is maybe not, but allow crafters to use those drops. So maybe a crafter cannot do something with that, like make that specific weapon, but if they get a hold of that weapon, then the crafter can do something with that weapon. And so there's a incentive or a value proposition with crafting, and then there's still a need to go and actually hope that certain things drop it from certain places. That would, especially when you talk about player trade, all of a sudden imagine you a crafter, you're like, yeah, I can't beat that boss, but somebody else can, and then they come to you to do the thing, whatever that thing ends up being. That would be my solution to that problem, but that would be just me.
Well, I mean, let's see what your community also thinks, right? Because that is definitely one of the things that we've been thinking about, right? And it's a difficult choice. Like, I don't know exactly what the best thing is. We've been going back and forth on that one.
Well, I'm interested to see what you guys end up shaking out from that, because you're right. Like, immediately it's because if everything's craftable, well, how do you craft it? Well, you need materials, and how do you get those materials? So it adds all those different knock-on effects. The Celtic Zombie says, I don't have any really good questions. Just how did y'all come up with the name for the game?
That was the hardest thing to do. That was so difficult. I don't know if you ever had to name a game, right? Like, I always have.
I name my projects after Greek gods. So like all of my
but is that the final name?
No.
Well, there you go, right? And
marketing
then having to come up with a final name.
Marketing will come in and it's like, I will still internally call it Zeus. It's like, all right, but then, or whatever y'all ended up selling it as. There we go.
Well, I don't know. Like, so with Ori and the Blind Forest, right? Like, it was originally called Sign, because Sign is kind of like the German word for to be, and that kind of like, for me, always kind of like had a nice touch that the story is kind of like a coming of age story, and it uses that word and so on. But then ultimately we had to change that because we found out that Square Enix literally copyrighted almost all fucking German words, because they use German words in their titles, right? And it's just, we couldn't do it. So we had to flip it. And then for Wisps, I was extra smart, and I named the game, it's Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Before I even know what the Will of the Wisps was.
There we go.
But I like the sounding of it, right? Like just the how it sounds. And then for Wicked, it was really hard. Like, it started as Project A and B, literally because that character that I did in the prototype had an X and a blade, right? Like, and so it was A and B. And then code name was Forsaken, because it's this rundown world, and it kind of made sense, right? But that also still, we had some issues, copyright, blah blah blah. And then No Rest for the Wicked was a title that I had in mind for a long time, because ultimately I think once people see the entire thing in 10, 15, 20 years that we have planned, um,
Be older men
that,
then.
yes,
It's like,
um, I think it speaks to what I want to say with the story, and I'll leave it there.
yeah.
It obviously goes back to the whole biblical meaning of the phrase.
Leap Play says, "What do you think of covenants like they are in Dark Souls, and are there any similar systems planned for Wicked?"
Um, maybe. So, I mean, we obviously have a development plan, right? And so we're constantly going through the whole when are we doing what, right?
Mhm.
And on the development plan itself, well, there's a lot on the list, right? And we're still, like we always kind of like have to adjust things a little bit, right? And again, like it's a question of when does what make sense? When are releasing what? And also how does it fit together? Does it make sense marketing wise and so on? I like the Covenant stuff. It's not a super high priority item, right? And it does come up every now and then. Same with factions, for example, right? But we'll have to see.
We'll have to see. The Alex writes, "How's the team doing, and what are your thoughts on the release so far? Like, how has the reception to the game been? Has it been better than you expected, or like, where does it? How's the team doing?"
Yeah, I mean, we broke through our expectations.
Good.
We were very scared about early access because who knows how that works, right? Like, this is the first time we've ever done it. We knew we shipped a fairly small slice of the game. We had no idea how that would be perceived and so on. Thankfully, a lot of the industry pundits and gamers and so on kind of like understood what we are doing with this game, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that was, like, oh my god, I'm so thankful for that, right? Because it could have gone the other way as well, right? That it's just, oh, keep that game because I don't care, like just finish the thing. But with this kind of game and with the vision that we have, it would be impossible. Like, you just cannot do it. I don't care how good a developer it is. I don't care how many people you have, right? If you plan something like that, if you try to kind of like really change the status quo, you need to get it out there. You need to get it into people's hands. You need to get that feedback. You need to get the telemetry data. You need to see what works and what doesn't. And if you don't do that on that large scale, you just never know.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so I'm just generally like really grateful for how everything went. But we have a lot of stuff coming that we're extremely excited about. Like, just I can't wait. Like, a lot of times, like, people are like, oh, like I'm really looking forward to 1.0, and I'm like, even as a developer, I'm like, yes, me as well, because the game is going to be amazing at 1.0. Like, I can't, if we can do half of the stuff that we have planned, great. Like,
Yeah.
I think we'll be totally fine.
If 1.0 is any reflection of what you guys have already delivered, like I'd have no doubts in what you and the team
Well,
are working
1.0
on.
just has to be a lot more,
Of
right? Like,
course.
just a lot more on every level, right? So I think that's generally what people also just want, right? Like, just, hey, what you guys have released so far is cool, but it's a small amount of content, right? Turn it into 40, 50 hours instead, and we're good, right? But ultimately, I would also like to have the goal of, like, but let's see what we can do to really revitalize the genre, to do all the things that we always wanted to see.
Mm-hmm.
That might be too risky for other studios to do, right? But if we can make that work together, that would be the next step, right? Like, that would be the next thing. Like, it's always the difference between, did you make a really polished product, or did you cause some revolution, right? And usually, like, if you really make a paradigm shift, that has a different effect than if it's just, oh, that's a really cute version of that game, right? And ultimately, that's where we would like to be. We don't want to do games that are just, oh, this is really nice, this is a nice polished iteration of that, or plays like a Diablo clone or something, right? That's why Wicked is so different. Like, it would have been a hell of a lot easier to just make a Diablo clone and, like, put the moon twist on that, and that's it, right? But no, let's actually do all those things, like, like all this crazy stuff that we have in there, and let's create a believable world, and like with tons of interactivity, and do all those things that I always dreamed about that nobody else ever did for some reason, right? And let's see where we land, because that, unless you have the guts to do that, right, you're never going to land on that next level.
And then what ends up happening is that people become and look at it and say, "Oh, just do No Rest for the Wicked." And we've seen that time with a handful of games. Like I remember when Destiny originally launched, they were like, "Oh, it's Borderlands plus Halo," and then now it's just no, that's Destiny. That's what it's defined this entire gameplay loop. And so I think that's what you guys have delivered. Now, I do have one final question, and I don't know if you can answer this one at all. And I know I'm going to get so much hate from everybody who I didn't ask. Like, when's console release? You're not announcing a release date. We know it's coming to consoles, and
no,
the
we
console,
can't, obviously.
Yeah, the console player base is hungry and excited for that.
Yeah.
But obviously, news this year broke that Private Division is shutting down. They're either being however the company is doing it. Is there are you guys shopping around for another like partner in that regards, or are you going to go more independent? Like, is that anything you can share with the community? Because I know some people have been concerned by that.
Yeah, so what I can say is I don't think people should be concerned about that. Obviously, we are hard at work already on the next updates and so on, right? We have long-term plans for Wicked and so on. Private Division has been a great partner on Wicked. They literally like believed in us, let us do our thing, allowed us to take all these risks and so on, which we absolutely 100% do not take for granted, right? Like, look at the market out there, right? It's pretty crazy. But they believed in us. They saw what we did with the Ori games, right? And saw, okay, you guys are talented, right? We'll let you do your thing, which was super appreciative of. But Take-Two ultimately decided, hey, this, has to happen. So we are maneuvering that. But I can't go into details on like what that actually means. I don't think people have to be concerned. We are hard at work. We're doing the best that we can on just getting more and more updates out and so on. I think we'll be fine. Yeah, and I think we'll be able to make players very happy.
Well, you also like have a really like proven concept and product that I was like, well, yeah.
But that's what's helping us, right? Like, so I mean, we could have been in a lot of trouble if the game wouldn't have been very successful already, right? But it is a success already, right? And we have very huge aspirations to take it to that level that even a Diablo 4 or a Path of Exile or so on wouldn't go to. And maybe some people want to punch me for making that statement, right? But I always want to be, hoping we get to 150% so that even if we only get to 100, like we're good, we reached 100%, right? But that is going to be the interesting thing, right? The whole, can we really build that vision, that dream, right? And so, and if that's something, that I've been thinking about for 20 years, I think a lot of players will feel very similarly, right? Because I think a lot of players don't want to play the same old thing with a reskin with some better graphics or something, but it's kind of the same thing as what I played already 10 years ago, right? I think a lot of players just really, even if they don't know it, right? Because players usually, if you just go and ask them, right? Like, hey, what is the next thing that you will see? They just always want a faster horse, right? They'll never ask for the car because it's not their job to ask for a car. It's our job to understand that, analyze that, and know what a car is, right? And that the next step is you have to go to a motorized vehicle, right? Not just a faster horse. But yeah.
Before we wrap, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you were really that you were hoping we would, or that any information you want to share with the No Rest for the Wicked community?
Well, look, first of all, I just like to say I'm really appreciative of you making your videos and so on, and like keeping the community updated on Wicked and so on, right? Like that, we're super appreciative of that. So that's already that. The other thing, like I would love to show you more stuff of what we have planned. Yeah, but I can't right now, right? Simply because we also want to keep the surprises going, right? Every now and then I can't help myself to kind of like put a little tease or something out there, but I'm keeping it very tight anyway because I know the team would kill me if I divulge too much. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff coming that I'm just really excited about. Really, really excited about. Even just the multiplayer and the way we approach it is going to be really different. I think it's also going to be controversial to some degree, right? But
please keep friendly fire in. Like, it's like, don't. I was like, you said that's going to be there. We're not going to intentionally try to kill each other, but that does change combat and strategy
Completely.
because otherwise it's like we're just gonna
Completely.
blitz everything and then there's no challenge.
That's the huge problem, right? So I mean, I'm sure we'll get a lot of from people, right? And maybe some negative Steam reviews again, and
Oh, maybe.
review bombing, and
But there's like,
that kind of.
did you play Helldivers 2 at all?
I didn't yet,
Okay, so
sadly, right? This came out right when
yeah,
we were like, oh, we have to finish Wicked.
there was a moment with me and my friends playing Helldivers where we're being rushed, and it creates this comedy moment where, for whatever reason, one of my friends just dove right in front of me, and I shot him and killed him as I was firing at a monster, and we're like, oh, dude. You love that bug so much. You'd lay down your life for it. We were just cracking up. And it just adds in that moment. Yeah, it's okay. Maybe we got killed, but those are unique moments that don't, or we've seen. I felt like games have kind of stepped away, trying to make it too safe. And I'm personally looking forward to accidentally killing some of my friends.
I mean, what I would love for people to understand, right, is that when we make a decision like that is fairly controversial, right? Like, hey, we have friendly fire in the game. We know a lot of people's immediate instinct is, what the fuck, right?
Yeah.
Like, why? Like, haven't you learned from Double Dragon, right? Like, who does that?
Good callback, though. Good game.
But the reason why we do it, right, is obviously we have tried the other way and we couldn't make it work.
Yeah.
So we tried the other way. We tried it without friendly fire, and it's just not fun if 4 people run to one enemy, just smash out of it, and the enemy doesn't have any way to react or do anything, and that's it, right? And then you do it again and again and again. It's not fun. And so what we saw the moment we turned on friendly fire, right, like this was a wild idea that we just threw around, because we also thought, no, nobody wants friendly fire, right? But we turned it on, right, and we immediately saw, oh no, I hit you with my greatsword, sorry, right? And then 5 minutes in, you were like, oh, we have to be really strategical, right? Like, I have to communicate with you now. I have to tell you, I'm going in for that hit, right? And then, like the other guy's like, oh, I'm throwing a fireball, right? And that was so fucking fun, right? Like, that changed the game so massively, right? That people suddenly had to communicate with one another. That it was just immediately clear that, hey, for this kind of game, right, with this kind of combat system, if it's just a messy gangbang for every enemy, right? It doesn't work. It's not that fun. But once we did that and people had to communicate and actually strategize, suddenly multiplayer was playing the single player, right? Where it's like, okay, it's about strategy, it's about pacing, it's about timing, it's about space. And that just immediately was a clear decision, like, okay, yeah, this is the way to go, right? So I hope people would understand that, right? Because a lot of times when we introduce some system or say something that is not liked, right, like the immediate instinct is to go, well, what the fuck, like, I don't like this system in this other game, right? Which, by the way, does not necessarily mean that we do it in the same way, that it'll be also bad here, right? That's the thing with art, right? Like, somebody tries something, it doesn't work. The next person tries it, it doesn't work. The next person tries it, pushes it a little further, right? And then when you get to the 10th person, suddenly it's like, oh my God, of course, should have always been there, right? We should have always done it this way. Why not, right? And, like, we just hope we hit that sweet spot.
Yeah, I think you guys have. I'm really excited about this game's future, but I think it's my personal responsibility now to let you actually go get some sleep. So I don't know why I like that.
No, I'll still be working for like 2-3 hours. I'm working
dude,
every day till like 2-3
that's
a.m.
the dev. Like, sometimes, like, when I talk to my wife, I'm like, my brain, I'm on. Like, I've got, I'm putting it in. I'm excited about it, and then. Yeah. So anyway, I'm going to let you get back to work. I'm going to hopefully let you get some rest. And I'm going to be obviously checking out all your updates over on Discord and on Twitter. Guys, be sure to follow Thomas or go and check out the No Rest for the Wicked Discord. They are absolutely paying attention to what you guys have to say and think. So thank you, Thomas. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your day. It really means a lot to me.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun. And if you want to do follow-ups or something, right, you can always reach out to me.
Whenever, and if yeah, I'll do that. And I was going to say, like, when you kind of have your big releases, I think those will be a really good time, because then we can actually, like, oh my gosh, we've gone hands-on. and really break it down, which will be fun. So
might also be really fun to just shoot the shit from a developer's perspective, right? To just talk about the industry and so on, because that's always, like
dude,
there's a lot of stuff happening.
I
Would
love
be
that.
fun.
I love that because like I'm an outsider, kind of, like I'm doing stuff, but it's still like, all right, well, I think this is what's happening. Does anybody else see this? Am I just crazy?
Well, everybody starts that way, right?
Yeah, exactly, 100%. All right, we're gonna wrap up. Thanks, guys, for watching and listening, and I'm just gonna wave it out.
Thank you.
I almost feel like jumping in as Ferris Bueller right now and saying, "Hey, y'all are still here, and thank you so much for being here. It really does mean a lot. I'm very curious as to your thoughts about this interview. I'm very curious about your feedback. I don't get many opportunities like this, and this was a really nice opportunity. I really am very, very impressed with No Rest for the Wicked and the dev team, and I cannot wait to see what they have in store for us. And it sounds like we're in for both a wild, awesome ride, but a journey nonetheless. We'll be sure to be covering this on future live streams and so much more, but I just wanted to spend some time to thank you and to thank the members of the channel and to thank all of those who jumped on kind of the engagement aspect of this video to really kind of support it. It does mean the world to me. And also thank you to my wife for giving me the opportunity and time. That way I could sit down and uninterruptedly focus in and on his answers to those questions. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the questions. I appreciate you. If you did make it all the way to the end of this video, sound off with the secret call out, hooty hoot. Love it. Thank you so much for being here. And hopefully I will see you guys in the next video. But until then, take care.